I would like to invite my dear old friend that I met so many years ago at John McBride's summit over at the Pepke Auditorium, Lester Brown, who is absolutely one of the leading thinkers in not only the United States of America, but all over the world. He's published in, I think, over 50 languages, has written copiously, published over 50 books, and is one of the most highly regarded thinkers in the world in terms of the state of our world and its various systems. So without further ado, I would like to have Lester Brown join me here at the podium for remarks. And Les, would you mind stepping out front just for a second here, because I have something that I need to do. And that is to present you with the AREDAY Lifetime Leadership Award for your commitment and undying determination to educate us to the conditions that we find ourselves. Thank you so much for your years of leadership, Les.
Never can tell.
Yeah, okay.
Just wanted to say it's enough of an honor being here without getting something to take away. So this has been an unexpected honor and recognition. Thank you very much. And thank you also for organizing this. You and Sally have been doing this now for many years, and it is one of the places of which we need many, where ideas come together and we advance our thinking as a result of that. And that's what makes it exciting. This morning, I'm going to be drawing heavily from a new book on water, on the world water situation, the world water balance, if you will. And I am sometimes asked why I do books instead of reports and articles and so forth. I do some of those occasionally, but the great advantage to doing books, if you're trying to reach a global constituency, is that there is a network of publishers in key countries around the world that will translate and publish in the local language. And that's why, as Chip was saying, there are 54 books out there now, and they've yielded, I think it's 567 language editions. So the books do give you leverage. And not only that, but they often pay you for the right to publish the book. The water issue is beginning to surface in terms of public attention. Let me just back up and establish one more link that I think will help you in thinking about the food-water relationship. To produce 1 ton of grain requires 1,000 tons of water. Each year, we produce 43, an additional, this is the world, each year the world produces an additional 43 million tons of grain. That requires each year an additional 43 billion tons of water. 1,000 tons of water for a ton of grain. And we're now reaching the point where it's difficult to find those 43 billion additional tons of water. And the leading scientific groups are now beginning to focus attention on this. The National Academy of Sciences, in a projection a year or two ago, said that by 2030, the world demand for water would exceed the supply by 40%. This is the National Academy of Sciences. NASA, National Aeronautics and Space Administration, has been using satellites to gather data on the Earth's major underground aquifers, because that's where so much of our water comes from, particularly for irrigation in agriculture. They looked at the 37 largest aquifers, 21 of which are shrinking fast. 13 are shrinking at a, quote, disturbingly rapid, end quote, rate. And we know this is happening. We can measure it, we can see it, but it's very difficult to do something meaningful about it. I want to run through the big three countries, India, China, and the United States, and give a sense of the kinds of problems that each of these three countries are facing. The three countries together produce about half the world's grain: India, China, and the United States. In India, you don't need a license to drill a well. As a result, there are now 27 million wells pumping water in India with no license, and the result is predictable. Water tables are now falling in every state in India. One of the things that we're beginning to look at more closely, we, the scientific community, is the ratio of pumping to recharge. Ideally, that should be 1-to-1. In India, in northwest India, which has the fastest pumping anywhere in the world, they are pumping the aquifer at 15 times the rate of recharge, 15-to-1. You can do that in the short run, but you cannot do it in the long run. India has 1.3 billion people. It is adding 19 million a year. That's almost another Australia each year that India now has to feed. So the situation does not look very promising in India, and the government appears not to have the capacity to organize an effective response to this, because it takes a lot of involving people and doing things differently and emphasizing efficiency rather than the use of water per se, and it's just not working very well. China is today, on the waterfront, perhaps the most interesting country in the world. China now has 1.4 billion people. In 1950, according to the Chinese government data, they had 50,000 lakes and rivers. Today, they have 23,000 lakes and rivers. So you can sort of sense the water tables falling and things drying up from those numbers. Beijing reports that the country is losing 1,400 square miles of productive land each year, either grazing land or cropland, because it's drying out. To sort of visualize that, that's a section of land 10 miles wide and 140 miles long. Each year, they're losing that to the desert, mostly coming from the west and some from the north. Now, they know it's happening. They're measuring it. They're concerned about it, but they can't do anything about it because it's coming from the drying out and the deserts. The dust storms in this part of the world have increased enormously over the last few decades. So it's frustrating, and the Chinese know and say that they can't stop it. So then you just sit and wait. So it's a very difficult, and unlike almost anything we've faced before. Just to give you an indicator of how much pressure there is now on land and water resources in China, and I would never have thought of this myself, China had 635 golf courses. They're starting to plow them up and plant them to grain. 111 have been plowed up so far. They just started a year or so ago. But the plan is to eliminate all the golf courses in China, plow them up, plant them to grain. I mean, who could have imagined these kinds of stresses and these kinds of responses just a few years ago? The United States, we have two major aquifers. The Central Valley Aquifer in California, which is where so much of the fruit and vegetables and nuts come from, not only for us, but a good part for export to the rest of the world as well. The pumping to recharge ratio in the aquifer in the Central Valley is 2-to-1. I mean, that's a lot better than 15-to-1, but we are pumping that aquifer at twice the rate of recharge. So 25 years probably, there won't be much irrigated agriculture left in that area of California where they're so heavily dependent on underground water. In the high plains of the US, the Ogallala Aquifer, and this is basically from Nebraska south, and this aquifer underlies most of the land between the Mississippi River and the Rocky Mountains. And it is being overpumped. The ratio for that region is 14-to-1. We are pumping it at 14 times the rate of recharge. That is, for each gallon of water from rainfall or ice melt or what have you, we're pumping 14. Again, that's not a viable option. In California, we have known, and other parts of the Southwest as well, that many migrants from Mexico have been moving across the border in search of work. Now, there's a second flow of refugees coming from Mexico across the border, searching for water. Mexico City, if you follow it all, is just a mess in terms of water. And so we're seeing these stresses beginning to drive these trends. After the big three, India, China, and the US, we can look at some of the countries not quite as big, but large and important. Iran, for example. The Persian Empire has existed, what is now Iran, has existed for 7,000 years. It goes way back in history, ancient Persia. Now, it's probably the 70% of the southern part of the country has been mostly evacuated. There just aren't many people left because the aquifers, which weren't all that strong to begin with, have been depleted. Iran today has 79 million people. Hydrologists in Iran calculate that they have enough water to support 25 million people. So Iranians are leaving. They're migrating out of Iran. And surprisingly, many of them are migrating to California. I think there are something like at least 400,000 Iranians in California. I mean, that's sort of out of the pot into the fire in a sense, because the problems in California are pretty serious too. And then we're seeing something new in many parts of the world. North Africa, the Middle East, across northern China, we're seeing huge dust storms, unlike anything in the past. Pakistan, another second-tier country. Water tables are falling throughout Pakistan. Lahore, the capital, has 7 million people, and it's entirely dependent on groundwater. But that's a huge concentration of people to support on groundwater alone. So its days are numbered. And the question becomes, where do you put the new capital in Pakistan? And that's not an easy one, because water, you have to have water. Both the World Bank and the UN Environment Program have expressed doubt about the future of Pakistan as a country. They are not certain that it can survive, even though it has 199 million people. Where do they go? And that's the unanswered question. I mentioned Mexico earlier. We used to have work migrants. We now have water migrants. Where in the southwestern United States, that whole region is beginning to dry out. In fact, hydrologists have pointed out that the U.S. west of the Mississippi is now drying out almost everywhere. And it's going to continue. There's not anything in prospect to stop it. We're also beginning to get hints of shifts in world trade. It used to be that the U.S. was the world leading grain exporter, was then way back, and is today. The U.S. totally dominates world grain exports. But we're probably going to see some changes in thinking, because part of that grain is being produced by overpumping, which you can only do in the short run. So we may well start to see restrictions in this country on grain exports. I mean, why would a country want to export grain if it's in the process depleting its aquifers? It's a new world out there. When I started working in the Department of Agriculture in 1959 in the Foreign Agricultural Service, the big thing was trying to figure out how to export more grain and develop more markets. And that's what the Foreign Agricultural Service is for, is really to foster U.S. sales of farm commodities, importantly grain, to other countries. Someone has said, what we need is a market for water, a world market for water. We actually have one. It's called the world grain market. Most of the water that crosses national boundaries does so in the form of grain. Grain is the totally dominant form of moving water around the world. As a result of these dust storms, we're seeing a number of new stresses developing. One is conflicts within countries, between countryside and city, among countries. We're also seeing migrants, huge numbers of migrants. Example, China is moving, this is China, there are 250 million people living in west central China, which is drying up. The Chinese government is moving 250 million people to the eastern part of China. I mean, when you think about that, 250 million, we only have 315 million people in this country. So that's almost, the number of people being moved is almost as big as the US population. Another consequence, in addition to conflicts and migrants and dust storms, another consequence of water scarcity is failing states. There are a number of countries that simply are not politically strong enough to manage and respond to this problem. We're looking at a growing number, a list that gets longer and longer of failing states because of water. Afghanistan, Nigeria. Nigeria has, what, 190, almost 200 million people. And the land, if you can sort of visualize this geographically, this is Africa, and Nigeria is down on the southern coast. The Sahara is advancing southward. And as it does, farmers and herders in Iran are being pushed ahead, villages are being abandoned, and that area is getting smaller and smaller. And so the Nigerians are beginning to move east, try to find some place where they have a chance of surviving. So it's a very destabilizing sort of situation that Nigeria, indeed, many countries in Africa are in now with these, with the number of migrants. And we're going to see an increase, probably a dramatic increase in the number of failing states as a result of water stresses. We're seeing deserts expanding all over the world, but particularly in the Middle East, North Africa, Central Asia, North Asia. Having meetings like this is very helpful because it gives us a chance to look at these ideas in a way that we, in our day-to-day routines, might not see them. And it's going to take an enormous effort to reverse this deterioration that's underway because of aquifer depletion and spreading water scarcity. I cannot think of any threat to civilization that's greater than this, that is stronger or affecting more people. The challenge is, I mean, we can't escape this. The challenge is to not just halt population growth, we've got to reduce it. Because it's clear we don't have enough water to support the current one. So the family planning people are still talking about shifting to smaller families and the advantages of doing so. But the family planning community and demographers generally have not yet realized why we not only have to stop population growth, but reduce population size. That's the new one in the mix, and that's a very different and undoubtedly more difficult issue to deal with. Currently, the number of births per thousand is something like 21. The number of deaths per thousand is something like 8. So world population is growing by about 1.2% per year. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but it is 85 million people each year in a world where water resources are fast being depleted. It's a real challenge. I mean, I don't think very many of the world's national political leaders have any understanding of what's happening with water in the world and what they should be doing about it. That's one reason for doing this book, which is called Countdown, the spread of water scarcity in the world, or something like that. It's not firm yet. I'm working with Norton on the final title. And the question is, what can you and I do? We all have a stake in the future. And one of the things, first of all, is to help the world understand what this problem is. I mean, all of us are members of organizations, and some of them are worldwide. Rotary, for example, or some of the environmental groups now are worldwide. But the weakness in the whole system is that very few people have the time to look at the big picture and then translate that into policy for their organizations. And that's why, again, meetings like this, I think, are so helpful. I'm one of those rare speakers who finishes ahead of time. I still have 6 minutes and 37 seconds. If we can take questions or?
Yes, please.
Yes.
One of the things that I think you know is that I know you know that Israel is recycling about 90% of its water, and it's probably the only country in the world that's attempting that on that scale. But the question is, are the efforts and the processes that they have established institutionally scalable to countries as big as China or India? Or is that really something that can only be done on a small scale?
It's an interesting question. I've asked myself that question. But I mean, Israel is a model. If there is a model in the world, Israel is the model for how you handle a tightening water supply. But your point, can China do that? I mean, Israel is kind of a unique society in many ways, very cohesive, and it's easy for the country to do things and get the public support to do it. It's not quite that way in Indonesia or China or some of the other countries, or not Nigeria, for example. I mean, Nigeria, to talk about the government of Nigeria is to use your imagination and using the term government. I mean, it's really not functioning as a government. And Nigeria is breaking down. Almost without question, it's going to be a failing state. And we don't have much experience with failing states. And it's something that we need to recognize as one of the consequences of spreading water scarcity.
Hello. I have a question over here. Lester. Okay. So a point about Nigeria, and then a question. Nigeria is a very serious problem because by mid-century, it's projected to have the third largest population in the world, after China and India, and it does not have the resources to support that. So it's a massive looming problem out there. Second thing is,
let me respond to that. A second, go ahead. Go ahead with the second question.
Second question is, institutionally, I agree with you that people aren't aware of this. World leaders are not aware of the water problem. Would you advocate forming a new agency, kind of like the International Energy Agency, something like the International Waters Agency?
Yeah.
That would be
Good
part of the
question.
UN association to raise awareness, provide information, convene people to address these issues?
Right. I've thought a bit about that. And in the UN, we have a number of specialized agencies, the World Health Organization, WHO. We have FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization, for example. And there are several others. You can go down the list. UNICEF is another. But what we need for water is a water agency, an organization that focuses on water itself. And we don't have that yet. So as your question implied, do we need an agency on water? Without question, because that's where some of the most important actions that we will take will lie in the years ahead. And we don't have any place in the UN for that really to be managed properly. And it could also oversee the setting of goals on what countries would do, And it would give it some authority to enforce those goals as a UN agency.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, I was going to ask almost the same question if we're going to copy the regime we have for climate for water, but I think you answered that question now. Then I have another question. Given that the business model, or whatever you call it, for water is quite immature, do you have any proposals on how we can go ahead with maturing sort of the water market as such?
Right. I think the UN needs to make this a major initiative, both helping people to understand, and that's why we need a new agency in the UN that focuses on water in the same way we have agencies on health and agriculture now. So it's going to be a challenge, but we need it. And if the UN begins making this an issue, it will help other organizations and groups, national governments throughout the world to begin to focus on this and give the water issue some of the attention it needs. But clearly we need a UN water agency, no question.
I think this is, such an important issue that we're talking about now, and that to have a UN recognition. My experience with the UN, though, is that there's never any real enforcement. And maybe we, in our organizations, can create a model group that partner them, just like Ted Turner did with UN Foundation, and maybe work with them to create the model agency and then partner with them so we get their level of distribution, awareness, the effectiveness in education, but it's very dysfunctional in terms of governance and enforcement. So we'd want to, water is the key issue. So it would be important not to give it away to an agency that's not going to do anything about it, but so maybe that's a thought.
Right. There's a lot of things that groups, many of which are represented in this room, can do. But I think in the end we're going to have to change the structure, the UN structure, by adding another agency. Otherwise, you and I and others in groups can do things, but we don't have the leverage at the global level that a UN agency does. And particularly in working with national governments. National governments don't like to take on things that are difficult and complicated. You'd think the Indian government would be spending almost half its energy on the water issue. They don't even have a water agency. They have a water minister, but not an agency. So it's going to require some restructuring in our thinking, obviously, but restructuring in the institutions of countries at the national level, and then the same thing at the UN level. We have 1 minute and 13 seconds left.
Amanda Ellis, I was ambassador to the UN in Geneva the last 3 years, so I just wanted to respond to what you've just said, which was very sensible. So the only binding constraints on countries are through Security Council resolutions. All the General Assembly resolutions are non-binding, as you pointed out. But in 2015, all 193 countries came together to create the Sustainable Development Goals. And goal number 6 is actually clean water and sanitation. So there's already a structure there. Now, the new Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, who was previously the head of the High Commission, he was the High Commissioner for Refugees, is, I think, very sensitive to these issues, and he's putting his top team in place at the moment. His deputy, Amina Mohammed, who is Nigerian, is fabulous, and she is in charge of the Sustainable Development Goals. So I do suggest we have some conduits, given that the UN and the World Bank are now partnering on these issues, and the the World Bank Senior Vice President for the Sustainable Development Goals, Mahmoud Mohideen, was just in the Horn of Africa last week and has mobilized $1.3 billion for the drought that is related to security issues there too. So I think that there is alignment. It's a matter of us taking this very good suggestion, your brilliance, the brilliance in this room, connecting it through Chip and others with the contacts to actually help bring those of us who want to make a difference together. Thank you.
We just hit 0. I mean that did.